Welcome back to Chess Dog. My name is John, and today we're looking at the Jobava London system. And what we're looking at today is what happens when you play a strong opponent who sort of knows all of the opening tricks and knows how to handle the game for the black side. Well, how do you continue with white? Well, the players in today's game are the best of the best. White is Magnus Carlsen, the world champion. His opponent is Benjamin Bok, who is a grandmaster with a FIDE rating of 2600. So you know he's not going to fall for any early cheap tricks. In this game, we get to see the Jobava London system played at the very highest level. And how does white proceed when all of the easy tactics are taken away? What do we do then? Let's watch how Magnus Carlsen handles it. He begins with d4, knight f6, bishop f4. So far it's a London system. It's not a Jobava London system yet. His opponent plays d5, e3, c5, and now Magnus plays knight to c3. Now it is a Jobava London system. This is the distinctive move of the Jobava London system, developing the bishop to f4, but then the knight goes to c3, and the basic threat here is the knight going to b5 and threatening a fork at c7. His opponent takes on d4, ed4. Now he plays a6. If he had played e6, then white could go ahead and play knight to b5 with threats to c7. The c7 square. Black could play knight a6, defending the square, and after c3, bishop e7, bishop d3, bishop d7, a4. White has a very good position. After he develops his knight from g1 to f3, almost every white piece will be better than its black counterpart, and black is sort of tied up. So Magnus's opponent avoids that, plays a6 to keep the knight out of that b5 square. And this is a good approach for black in the Jobava London. Magnus plays bishop to d3, which is the second most commonly played move. Knight f3 is most common. He's playing against that bishop at c8. He doesn't want it to be able to come out to the f5 square. Knight c6, knight c to e2. He defends d4, which was attacked by the knight at c6, so he also unblocks his c-pawn, which can now move to c3. Bishop to g4, c3, e6. And now we have the Carlsbad pawn structure. This is the same pawn structure you get in a Queen's Gambit declined exchange variation, but now the colors are reversed. It's exactly the same structure white gets in a Caro-Kann exchange variation. Traditionally, white will play on the king side, black will play on the queen side, but this game does not develop in the traditional manner. Carlsen plays queen to d2 to get his queen out of the pin of the bishop at g4. Black plays bishop to h5. He wants to play that bishop back to g6 to neutralize white's bishop on d3. The bishop at h5 is technically a bad bishop because the central pawns are on the same color, the light squares. He would like to trade that off for white's good bishop at d3. Magnus plays bishop to g5, pinning the knight at f6. The bishop goes back to g6. Magnus plays knight to f4 because he wants to recapture on d3 with the knight. The knight will be well placed on d3. Bishop takes d3, knight takes d3, and you can see that knight can hit the e5 or the c5 square. So it's well centralized, has a lot of flexibility, and can do a lot of things from d3. Black plays bishop to d6, and white plays knight to f3. Now, if we're completely honest with ourselves here, black has equalized. And a player of Benjamin Bok's caliber would probably not have much trouble holding a draw here against almost any grandmaster. But he's not playing any grandmaster. He's playing Magnus Carlsen. And Magnus has the ability to squeeze a lot out of a very small advantage. He accumulates very small advantages, and he can get a lot out of it. Not to mention, he's probably the greatest endgame player that has ever lived. So let's watch how Magnus handles this position moving forward. Bok plays knight to e4. Now, that knight was pinned to the queen, but he can move it to e4 because now he attacks white's queen. So both queens are hanging, and both queens are captured. Magnus takes on d8. Benjamin Bok takes on d2. Magnus retakes the knight with the king. Benjamin Bok recaptures the bishop with the rook. Magnus plays his h-rook to e1, centralizing it, placing it opposite the black king, and black castles. Now, there's a little distinction here. Look at the placement of the two kings. Black's king is safer, but Magnus Carlsen's king is better placed for the endgame to be active. Now, you can always get in trouble if you're not careful, but Magnus tends to be careful. He plays a4, attempting to gain space on the queen side, not attempting to do it, successfully doing it. And he wants to play a5 and fix that weakness at b6 and a backwards pawn on b7. Rook to c8, a5. I call that a backwards pawn at b7. Technically, it isn't because it's not a half-open file, but he can still get at it with a rook lift. a5, fixing the weakness at b6. Rook f to e8. Now, Magnus makes a critical decision. He decides to offer the trade of all of the minor pieces and enter a pure double rook endgame, thinking he has good chances of outplaying his opponent in that position. So he plays knight f to e5, and all of the minor pieces do get exchanged. Bishop e5, knight e5, knight e5, rook e5. Grandmaster Bok plays f6. He has a central majority. He has 2 pawns in the center, the D and E pawns, versus 1 pawn for Magnus, just the D pawn. So he's trying to get his pawn majority in the center moving forward. And he does it with tempo, playing f6, attacking the rook on e5. The rook comes back to e3. The king goes to f7, beginning to centralize. Now rook to a4. Now that's that rook lift we were talking about. He wants to target the b7 pawn, play rook to b4. Rook takes b7. His opponent, seeing this, decides to play rook to c4. And this is an offer to go into a pure single rook endgame, rook versus rook. Now, these are hard to win. They have a tendency to be drawish. I think Grandmaster Bok was counting on that in making this trade. Rook takes rook, dc4. So the pawn on c4 right now is fixing that pawn at b2, and there's a little weakness at b3. So Carlsen immediately liquidates it with pawn to b3. And this was a very strong move, and now Carlsen is beginning to get an edge in this endgame. What he wants to do is clear that pawn out of the way to allow his c and d pawns to advance and move forward. Grandmaster Bok plays rook to c8. Rook goes back to e1, cb3, rook to b1, preparing to capture the pawn at b3. Rook to c4. Now, in this position, it might not have been a lot of fun for Grandmaster Bok, but he probably would have been better off playing passively with rook to c7. You know, we're all taught in endgames, particularly rook endgames, to never play passive chess. So very few people would intuitively make the decision to play passively. But in this situation, it was probably the best choice. He plays the rook to c4. Rook takes b3, and now rook to a4, and this is a mistake. The reason is that Carlsen takes the pawn at b7, and now this c pawn has no pawn that can stop it. The pawn at b7 at least could have slowed down the advance of the c pawn, but now this pawn cannot be stopped by another pawn. So Magnus takes that b7 pawn with check. The king goes to g6, the rook goes to b6, targeting a6 and the e6 pawn. Rook a5, rook takes e6. Now, Magnus is going to allow this check hitting these back rank pawns. He's going to lose a couple of pawns. But he's saying, yes, I will lose a couple of pawns, but it doesn't matter because my c pawn is so fast. There's no way black's going to be able to get those pawns and stop it. Just no way. And that's exactly what happens. Rook to a2 check, king to d3. Magnus loses his first pawn. c4. Magnus loses his second pawn. c5. And king f5, rook e1. Notice there's no way Magnus is going to let black's king cross that e file. He keeps the rook on that e file, so the king can do nothing. It cannot get over to do anything to stop the pawns. The rook goes to b2, and the final move of the game, c6. And there's nothing black can do to stop the pawns. They're just too fast. Those pawns go forward together, and white wins easily from this position. So it can give us some confidence if we play the Jobava London ourselves that the world champion, Magnus Carlsen, feels confident playing it against very strong opposition. And it shows us that if we don't get some of the easier attacking techniques that we like to get in the Jobava London system, that we still can have a very good game. We can still outplay our opponent and win. I hope you enjoyed this game. Like the video and subscribe if you haven't already. And I hope to see you again at Chess Dog. Goodbye.